rather than having a population level control which would be disproportionate. And again, you have to assess it against the background, which is wild birds don't just go to wetland centres.
Yeah, so last year we experienced an unparalleled epidemic of H5N8. So this type of avian influenza was driven by disease in wild birds in more species, more widespread than we'd seen it before, which was a challenge for the whole of Europe. We're obviously monitoring that, and we're starting to see cases of H5N8, not that many, but they're appearing in Europe again. So we've just raised the risk of H5N8 in wild birds in this country to medium. The risk to domestic poultry remains at low, but that could increase if we see a further increase in the disease in wild birds. So what we saw last year was a very strong threat from wild birds, from migrating wild birds. Previously we'd only seen isolated cases. Last year we saw a number of cases from east to west, or in the east and in the west. And that made us look with our European colleagues at what the risk factors were, and it was quite clearly aquatic wild birds, which means that high concentrations of those birds, bodies of water, are the highest risk, which led us, as we moved out of the full requirement for housing, to say there are higher risk areas where housing should be maintained. This year, if we've seen the same challenge from wild birds, we will of course consider a similar risk-based approach, which may mean that we require housing in those higher risk areas close within 5 kilometres of significant bodies of water. Yeah, we have to respond to what's actually happening, don't we? The intensity of risk. So if the intensity of risk is very high, it's quite possible it's a complete housing requirement. If it's focused, and across Europe we're seeing it focused in a similar way to the end of last year, it's possible we go for a more risk-based, only certain areas approach. But we'll have to see what happens. I really hope that it doesn't come over in this year in the same intensity that we saw last year. It presents a real conflict for producers. I will be saying that birds outside, especially in those areas close to bodies of water, even in normal circumstances, free-range production is a higher risk, and we know it is. Not just for avian flu, for other diseases as well, the birds are more exposed. That can be managed, it can be a very good system, but when there's high risk of avian flu, they're better to be housed, which leads you to say that house systems give you better disease security. If we're seeing a pressure from the retailers and consumers for birds that aren't caged, that means free range in those areas isn't a great option, which means you've got to consider other options like barn production, and this country hasn't traditionally done barn production. So my point is we need to think very carefully before we hit any real change as to what the best methods of production are.